Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
Hello there, very good evening to you. The holiday season has come and gone, but news and developing stories and things that keep us on our toes are literally there every day. So today on Vantage Point, we will be talking about so many things that have made and defined political decisions, policy changes throughout the year today. And we are just a few days away from New Year's. And we're definitely going to touch about some of the most defining moments of this year with none other than Dr. Dan Jayathilaka. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the program.
Well, the Bond Commission has been something that we've been touching on the entire year. Something that we've been having a lot of speculations of, but turned out to be true. Most of the analysis that you have brought and the insights that you've brought to the table has really turned out to be true. But right now we are at a very decisive juncture where people are waiting anxiously for the report. On the 1st of January, everyone will know what exactly went behind the doors, closed doors. And right now, what does it say of the government in the future? Do you think this report will have a feature that will decide what the government is going to be and their next move is going to be?
Well, it's absolutely decisive. It will decide the fate of Sri Lankan politics, and it's also clearly the most important commission report since the commission that decided to remove Madam Bananayaka's civic rights in 1980. Now, the Americans are very good with phrases, and you're probably familiar with their phrase, "Where does the buck stops?" That was very old, but during Watergate, it was how high does it go?
Right.
When did the president know and what did he know about it? And in that case, the president here, it's clearly the prime minister. Now, it seems like everything we can possibly say about the bond scam has already been said, especially on your station. But I would just add that we have to bear in mind the following things. Whatever Arjuna Aloysius did or did not do, he didn't hold a gun to somebody's head and say, "I want my father-in-law appointed governor of the central bank." Somebody decided to do that. And Arjuna Mahendran didn't hold a gun to anybody's head and say, "I want to come over from Singapore and be the governor of your central bank." He didn't force, I mean, nobody can blame a man for having a son-in-law. You can't blame a son-in-law for having a father-in-law.
Right.
What you can do is blame the person who brought him in when there were so many other competent people, such as Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy. Put him in charge of the central bank and not ensure that nothing happened which involved his son-in-law, who was a known businessman. So that's what accountability is about. We're talking about Geneva resolutions on accountability. Right. What about financial accountability? Accountability, in fact, originated, as you know, in the financial sphere with auditing procedures, accounting procedures, accountability. And you have here, according to the Auditor General and Deputy Solicitor General Yasantha Kodagara, two different sources. Right. You have the largest ever fraud from the state sector, which the effects of which will run on for an incalculable period of time. It's an open-ended hemorrhage.
And we shouldn't forget that it is the credibility of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which is the highest financial institution.
And it is a knock-on effect, therefore, on our standing in the world market.
Right.
So, in order to cover that up, or rather to compensate for that loss, the same people who drilled a hole are now telling us that we have to sell off our national assets because we are not doing too well. So it's a double whammy. It's not only theft, but it's also murder, because it's being used as an excuse to sell off our strategic national assets or to lease for decades.
So what other way, Doctor, do we have to bring in revenue to the country? As in, do you think the government will have a better shot at improving entrepreneurial skills and SMEs than investing the money that's already there through our assets, through our natural...
Well, I mean, if you sell off your national assets, you no longer have them by definition. It's like what Ronald Reagan said, when you play your last card, you no longer have it.
Right.
There's no comeback from that. I mean, Malik Samaravikrama says that, well, in 70 years, we get the majority share. In 70 years, we all, not only are we all dead, our children are also probably dead. That's ridiculous. So, as Professor Howard Nicholas, Sri Lankan born, his grandfather was the Postmaster General of Sri Lanka. He is a top-class economist based at the University of Rotterdam, lecturing also in Vietnam and China. As he said, the one thing that the Asian success stories, the economic miracles of the Far East,
Right.
what they never do is to sell their national assets. It can be a communist party ruled China or capitalist ruled Singapore. They don't touch the airports and the seaports. They don't do that. The other thing that they don't do, that nobody really does,
Right.
is to destroy a carefully nurtured manufacturing base. Now, the shipping industry is protesting against the budget. The footwear industry is protesting against the budget. These are not SMEs. I value SMEs,
Right.
but these are not SMEs. These are big established businesses. This is the creme de la creme of Sri Lankan manufacturing, of Sri Lanka industry. And never could I even imagine of a UNP government that would do this to the Sri Lankan manufacturing bourgeoisie,
Right.
to the capitalist class. This is blowing a hole in our manufacturing base. So there has to be a better way. This is homicide.
Right. So do you think...
And there is a better way. I mean, after all, look, Stephanie, just a few years ago,
Right.
we were clocking the highest growth rates in Asia outside of China. And Asia was clocking the highest growth rates in the world, still is. So something has gone very wrong.
But it was artificially inflated.
Well, artificially inflated what? From 7% to 8%? But now we're down to 3.3. We've never had 3.3 during 30 years of war. 30 years of war, we had an average of 5% growth.
Right.
For the first time, in peacetime as well, we are lower than what we had in wartime.
So do you really think the government has not taken measures to really develop our agricultural sector? Apparel sector is doing far better than all the other sectors right now. But do you think the government would have had a better chance of developing our economy if they had developed the already existing sectors like the agricultural sector? Or do you think it's good if they had an entrepreneurial market in the country?
Well, the entrepreneurs are up in arms because you're going to get a Indian, not just import of Indian footwear,
Right.
which that's okay. I'm wearing
But is it
Indian sandals
professionals
right
that
now.
they're going to be...
No, but you're having a manufacturing plant
Right.
in Sri Lanka.
But jobs.
Bottom
jobs.
trawling.
But that's jobs. Jobs for Sri Lanka.
So aren't Sri Lankans employed by Sri Lankan footwear industries? That's also
Yeah.
Sri Lankans.
Yeah.
And
So
it's
there
owned by
are
Sri
so
Lankans.
many youth there
It's owned by
who
Sri
are
Lankans.
suffering without employment.
And the Indian companies will pay less because labor is cheap in India. It will drive down wages.
Right.
Furthermore, we have now removed the restrictions on bottom trawling, fishing.
Right.
Bottom trawling is when you drop a giant net to the bottom of the sea, the floor, and you drag everything with it. And it's prohibited in many countries because then your fish are gone forever. So that's the end of our fishing industry. This is allowing, the Indians come into our waters anyway, Tamil Nadu
Right.
fishermen. That's bad enough. That's piracy. But our great friends Indians are unable or unwilling to stop their trawlers from poaching in our waters, and now we are removing the safeguards, and our waters will be denuded of fish because we are allowing bottom trawling.
Right.
And our fishing industry will be wrecked because we can't catch the fish that are on the surface since the bottom trawlers have taken them all.
Right.
Now, this is self-destructive, Stephanie. No government has done this stuff. Now, the head of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, a personal friend and a man whom I intellectually respect, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, has made a shocking statement, not because he is in any way unintelligent, but because that's the ideology of the government. What he has said is that, in developed countries, agriculture is only 13% of the economy. We're too much. We're 40 something. We've got to get down to 13. Stephanie, we are not a developed country. We are a country that's primarily agrarian. We need food security.
Right.
We should not be dependent as an island on the import of food. And if you have as a kind of a vision that we are going to shrink our agrarian sector to 13%, you're really talking about the economic and social genocide of the present.
Well, Doctor, speaking of the agrarian sector, we have an important story that we need to cover about the tea, because one of our biggest tea importers, Russia, has put a ban on our tea exports.
They've just lifted it.
They've lifted it.
It was a very narrow shave we had.
That's right. But we will talk about the negotiations that went behind, the true reason behind the ban itself, after this short commercial break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point. Well, just before the break, we spoke about one of our biggest tea importers, Russia, had put a ban about a week ago, which is about to be lifted. But the negotiations that went behind it really brought out a lot of information that any of us really knew. It's not really the pest problem that there was, as everyone knew, but there's also this Russian espionage who's involved in the whole incident. How exactly has this really brought about, how exactly has this ruffled Russian feathers, especially when it comes to diplomatic ties between Russia and Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is a country that strongly believes in the whole motto of friends of all, enemies of none. But how exactly did this turn the tables?
Well, Stephanie, I don't know whether there was any espionage involved, but there's speculation that there was. What we do know is that there seems to have been factors other than the pest and asbestos.
Right.
When it came to Sri Lankan-Russian relations. Now, I'm not basing myself on anything I've read on websites. That's not a very good source to go by. I'm basing myself on two things. Firstly, I have some inkling as to how Russia might view certain things, because there is a well-reputed journal called Security Index out of Moscow. It's published in English, in French, in Russian. The editorial board and the founders are top former Russian foreign ministers, diplomats, and security sector people. And there have been only 2 Sri Lankans on what's known as the International Experts Group of the magazine Security Index. One is Ambassador Janata Dhanapalan, the other is myself. And I'm the only one who is on the Sri Lankan who has actually been invited to contribute, and I've written articles for them. So I have some sense of the strategic and security perspectives out of Moscow. Now, the Sunday Times Colombo ran 2 stories, not one, 2 stories in the same edition of the newspaper over the Christmas weekend. What did it say? The stories said, if I may summarize it, there are 2 stories, big stories. There was this 22-year-old guy, supposed a Russian, suspected of being a computer hacker. He wasn't on the run. He came to Sri Lanka on holiday with his wife. young couple. Court in Florida, USA, named him as a person that the Americans want because they suspect that he was one of those involved in the so-called hacking by the Russians of pre-election American emails, Hillary Clinton campaign emails and so on. So the Florida court named this young man. The American embassy contacted the Sri Lankan foreign ministry. Now the foreign ministry, being the foreign ministry, should have understood that it's not a post office for the American embassy, and that if a Russian is involved, you're talking about something very sensitive, because Russia is a friendly country. Russia is, I mean, our economy, our diplomacy under the UNP is supposed to be economic diplomacy. Well, Russia, as we have been reminded, is utterly crucial to our economy, to the tea industry. Now, what they should have done is, they should have done two things really. They should have contacted the Russians and said, look, we've had this request. This is one of your citizens. What's the story? And the second thing is go up to the president and say, look, we have a bit of a sensitive problem. Instead, what happened was the foreign ministry told the Attorney General's department. The Attorney General's department told the CID to arrest this guy. So the 22-year-old Russian was arrested and produced in court. Lo and behold, who turns up in court? The American embassy with its own Sri Lankan lawyer and the Russian ambassador, not the present one, the one who finished his term and left, Karsheva. Very close to Sri Lanka, very close. Alexander Karsheva. The ambassador turned up with his lawyer, Upul Jasuri. And the Russians had made a request that we extradite this young man back home to Russia. Now, the Sri Lankans should have thought, hey, because the Americans are on one side, but this guy's a Russian citizen, right? And the Russians are our friends as well. In fact, they are closer allies throughout the war and so on. And we need them to buy our tea.
Right.
Now, a foreign ministry is supposed to work this stuff out. That's what the foreign ministry is for. So let's send the guy off to Russia. Right. But if you don't want to do that, then you take it right up to the president and say, and the president and Putin were close. We are also buying a ship from the Russians. We need them to buy our tea. So the president could have made the decision as to what you do with this young Russian guy. Instead, they had contacted the Attorney General's department and they'd locked this fellow up, and he was this deadlock with the Russians saying extradite him and the Americans saying no, we want him. So he was bailed out, and then he was taken in again because the Americans made the request again. And then he was bailed out for the second time, and then he skipped bail. Now, either he's around here somewhere, or he's back in Russia.
Right.
Whatever it is, it would seem, according to the newspaper articles in the Sunday Times, that the Russians took a rather dim view of the behavior of the Sri Lankan, or sections of the Sri Lankan state apparatus, which obviously believed that their duty was to do, was, when the Americans say jump, was to ask, how high, boss? And they jumped. Now, the Russians, I think, just reminded us very publicly and in a very humiliating way, just how much clout they have.
Right.
Now, we don't need to have undergone that. And my worry is that if this happened, and we almost jeopardized our tea industry because we were bowing to the Americans, if this happened to us this time, what happens the next time?
So this shows that the foreign ministry is definitely confused about what sort of diplomatic principles to follow.
No, they're confused about who they're working for.
That's right.
Which country they're working for and which country they're based in. And so obviously the Attorney General's department, or some people in the Attorney General's department. Because when it's a Russian national, the first thing you do is you contact your counterparts. I mean, I've been a diplomat. You contact your counterparts in the Russian embassy and say, look, we have a situation. And if they have made a request to you, you don't go along with what the Americans say and produce this guy and arrest him and produce him in court.
Right.
You've got a situation, you keep him on ice until it's resolved. You send somebody to Russia, you talk to the Americans. That's what diplomacy is about.
And with the current economic status, we cannot afford.
Absolutely. And Stephanie, what happens when the next time it's not the Russians? There's kind of a Cold War going on between the United States and the Chinese. And what if the Indians request a Chinese guy to be arrested? Or the Americans request a Chinese guy to be arrested, and we arrest a Chinese national?
Right.
It's going to be even more difficult and costlier than arresting a Russian and not extraditing him to Russia. And it might happen because the real pest is not the pest that got into the tea chest,
right,
but the parasites in the Foreign Ministry and the Attorney General's Department who think that they're working for the UNP, which they think is working for the Americans.
So there's definitely an agenda, and right before the break, we will have to remind our viewers as to what we are going to talk about next, which is definitely going to be the Jerusalem UN General Assembly vote, which really brought us back into that topic of whether or not the United States is losing its power in the world. Well, that's right after this short commercial break. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point, and up next, right before we wrap up, just 6 minutes before we wrap up, let's talk about the deteriorating U.S. power, U.S. influence over the world. That was kind of evident with the vote that took place at the UN General Assembly. 128 countries in favor, and which means 128 countries have turned their backs on the United States, and especially their allies, a NATO ally, Turkey, has turned its back on the United States. What does it really say? We're at a very decisive juncture when it comes to world affairs. The only cement that we thought would hold every country together, the United States, is now losing its power over the world. What's going on?
Well, Stephanie, it's interesting. Now, 128 votes, that's big. But just a few months ago, the United States lost by a bigger margin. There were 190 votes against the United States and only 3 votes for, and I'll tell you what that was about. That was about the economic embargo that the U.S. has on Cuba. And the Cubans, one country,
which was
small third world country,
hostile for a long time.
Fewer citizens than we have.
Right.
They beat the United States. They move a resolution in the UN General Assembly every year against the U.S., what they call the embargo, what they call the blockade. The Americans call it the embargo. And 190 countries, including Britain, voted with Cuba against the United States. Only 3 countries, the United States, Israel, and somebody else, voted with the U.S. So the moral of the story is, when you're in the wrong, morally, you can be the world's sole superpower, world opinion, and the states of the world don't go with you on that issue. Even your traditional allies don't do so. And you can be a small third world country. If you're in the right and you know how to communicate that, like Cuba does, you get 190 votes and reduce the Americans to 3. Now, a few months down the road, we have the Jerusalem vote. What happened was, we discussed it the last time, President Trump decided that the United States would recognize and act on the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The fact of the matter is that the world does not recognize an undivided Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's supposed to be a divided Jerusalem. That's East Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, of an independent Palestinian state. West Jerusalem of Israel, and the status of Jerusalem was to be settled as part of a comprehensive peace agreement which made for 2 states. And unless and until there's a 2-state solution implemented, Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem remains untouched, which is why everybody has their embassies in Tel Aviv. So, this came up in the Security Council. The United States vetoed the resolution, but 14 other Security Council members, except for the United States, and those 14 include Britain and France, voted against the U.S. decision to recognize Jerusalem unilaterally. But there was a veto, and that resolution could not pass. What happened then was that the same idea was taken up by Turkey, which is, as you quite rightly said, a NATO member. So, an ally of the US.
Right.
Turkey brought this resolution which said that the US decision was null and void. 128 countries, including Europe, I mean Britain, France, Germany, Japan, which is, it's been a lie, voted as one of the 128. This is despite some, maybe even because, President Trump and his ambassador Nikki Haley threatened to cut the contribution they make to the countries that would vote against the United States or on the other side of the United States on this issue.
Right.
Nikki Haley was very vehement on this. That backfired. Even Sri Lanka, I must say, whatever my criticisms of Sri Lanka's foreign policy and of the foreign ministry, I have to state on the record here that I'm happy and thankful that Sri Lanka did the right thing and voted with the 128. We could have taken the cowardly way out and abstained.
Right.
What happened was 128 voted for the resolution, 9 voted with the United States, only 9.
And Kenya abstained.
And 35 abstained because of economic pressure. So Sri Lanka did the right thing. There's speculation that the Muslim vote with the upcoming local government elections might have weighed in the balance, but then it would have weighed in the balance whichever government was in office. And we have had, as the foreign ministry points out, and I speak as a critic of the foreign ministry statement is quite right on this issue. It says Sri Lanka has a traditional policy on this issue of the two-state solution. And Sri Lanka voted in keeping with its traditional policy, which I might add is a bipartisan policy. And President Premadasa voted against the United States in 1991 when the US moved a resolution to repeal the 1975 resolution that Zionism is a form of racism. President George Bush Sr. addressed the UN General Assembly. But Sri Lanka voted against the Americans, and we were one of only 25 countries at that time. So we've always been principled, except at UNESCO we abstained twice recently under this government.
Right.
But we've generally been principled. We are back to being principled on this issue.
Well, Doctor, we've had an interesting 2017 indeed, especially when it comes to the bond transaction commission inquiry, and we had US President Donald Trump becoming President of the United States. It was an interesting year which really brought in a lot of aspects that the United States have had for a long time out into the open. This year has been a very interesting year, and it was great to share this year the information and the details and analysis that came about with our viewers who are watching us right now. And I hope this year will bring out the best for the next year, because after all, it's history that defines the future.
Right.
So thank you very much for being throughout 2017, and I hope 2018 will be as interesting as it is.
I'm sure.
As 2017 turned out to be. And thank you very much for joining us and being that support system for Vantage Point throughout the year of 2017. And I hope 2018 will be the same. Thank you very much for sharing your insights throughout the year, Dr. Zayan Jayathilaga.
Thank you, Stephanie, and Happy New Year to you and our viewers.
Well, today we didn't forget to mention some of the defining moments of 2017. 2018 is going to be a wonderful year too, and we hope you enjoy 2018 and have yourself a great new year. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Vantage Point.